Hello again. In this module, we will talk about making representations in the brain. So we've already talked about how a stimulus in the environment, how it gets broken down into sensations and is sent for processing to different parts of the brain through the primary visual cortex. In visual perception, the second big step is to take those sensations and perceive a form, to integrate them, to find a shape or a form somewhere in that. And further, there is an important aspect of recognition beyond form perception. So let's talk about these two higher level processes in the brain that allow us to perceive things and recognize them as familiar objects. So then, just to be clear, the first step is form perception. Form perception is a process through which the basic shape and size of an object are seen. So we take features and integrate them into some shape or some form, which can then be recognized, perhaps as a familiar object. Object recognition is the step in which this identification takes place. It does begin with the detection of simple visual features and the identification of form, but then we need to be able to match it to some prior experience, some prior representation in the brain, for example, and that is a second level of processing for the stimulus. So going back to the perceptual brain, we have incoming visual information that is processed by the primary visual area. This is where neurons are organized in columns and represent location, orientation of an edge, and the side of the visual field from which the information is coming. So columns within the primary visual cortex actually represent dominance depending on the eye from which information is coming. So they may be right or left ocular dominant. Here then we have maps of the visual field. This information is then carried in the ventral and the dorsal streams for further integration. And down the ventral stream is where we start seeing modules that are specialized for processing of one or the other type of objects in our environment. So some of the highest modules represent very complex and very defined processing of complex stimuli like faces. Clearly then, there has to be intense interconnectivity between the what and the where streams, the dorsal and the parietal stream. So while one is concerned with the identification of objects and involves the occipito-temporal pathway, and the other is concerned about location and spatial relationships, to have a coherent perceptual whole, we want to be able to integrate all of this information, and that has to come from very intense connectivity between these two. So David Van Essen, back in 1992, drew this block diagram based on all of the studies on visual processing that had been done at that time. And you can see that while there are many, many modules and different parts of the brain are in fact specialized for processing different aspects of a stimulus, there is a lot of connectivity. And since 1992, every study we've done has kind of added to this interconnectivity, added to the complexity of both feedback and feed-forward connections between these modules. So the big picture then is that there's a lot of parallel processing, a lot of information being processed through different channels within the brain. And at some point, all of these have to be recombined to give us a coherent percept. And this is called the binding problem. So the question, one of the biggest questions in the field, is how all of this information is recombined, bound together to give us form perception and perception of objects. The debate about how the visual system solves the binding problem continues, but several ideas have been proposed, elements of understanding about how the brain works that can help with the binding problem. The first of those is spatial position. The idea that all of the visual areas that are processing a particular shape or particular attribute, areas that are processing features of a particular object, are aware of the spatial position of that object. So when they connect the shape, color, and motion to the spatial position, you could then assume that it is the same object. That information then can be used to bind those different attributes of that particular object. The other idea that has been proposed is of neural synchrony, the idea that the visual areas which are processing these features of this particular object are all firing synchronously in a rhythm, in a pattern that can be identified as belonging to that object. And any change in that object, any movement, any change in spatial location, can then start a new pattern of activation. So in this example on the right then, you could imagine that neurons that are firing to different parts of the woman's body might have one pattern, and neurons that are firing to the dog might have a slightly different pattern, and also clearly slightly different spatial locations. So both the pattern of firing and the spatial position can in fact contribute to binding. The third thing that has been proposed and is hugely attractive is the idea that attention is crucial for binding of visual features. So when we pay attention to a particular object, then the firing of all of the areas that are processing all attributes of that object gets enhanced simultaneously, and that could contribute to the binding. And we know that when people don't attend to objects, or when people are not allowed to attend in masking experiments, we start seeing conjunction errors. Conjunction errors are errors in how the features are bound together. For example, in a task where stimuli are masked, so here are three stimuli, a red X, a blue S, and a green T, that are very, very quickly masked. So the processing is limited to a very brief period of time, about a fifth of a second. When subjects are asked to identify these objects, they very frequently make errors of conjunction and will report the correct letters, but misreport the colors for each of the letters. So this shows that both the features and the colors are in fact processed, but they are miscombined due to lack of attention or the lack of time for feature integration. This is also supported by evidence from individuals who suffer from severe attention deficits because of brain damage in the parietal cortex. These individuals are very typically impaired in tasks that require them to judge how features are combined to give complex objects, and they show recognition deficits for those objects. Studies suggest that synchronized neural firing occurs in an animal's brain when the animal is attending to a specific stimulus, but does not occur in neurons that are processing an unattended stimulus. So it seems then that attention might in fact be contributing to binding through enhancing neural synchrony or the rhythm of firing. The feature integration theory proposed by Treisman was the first that discussed this idea of attention contributing to feature integration, and they proposed that the first stage in object recognition is the pre-attentive stage, where features are processed separately, and then with focused attention comes a second stage where features are combined. So the role of attention is to serve as a glue between the physiology of the what and the where streams, and attention can enhance feature integration. Here is an example. I'm going to flash a word on the right of the screen. Let's see what you perceive. Did you perceive the letters TPUM, or like many subjects misread it as TRUM or even DRUM, which is a more familiar word? In experiments like this, where stimuli are presented briefly and perhaps not allowed to get to the focus attention stage, there are conjunction errors. And interestingly, the conjunction errors then rely on inferences about what might be there for people to report the stimulus. So in this case, very, very frequently, the more familiar word drum is reported. So it seems then that our interpretation of the visual input influences how basic visual features are processed and combined, and the percept itself developed including the influence of this interpretation. Clearly then, the early visual areas that analyze basic visual features and the late higher order areas that analyze large-scale form interact to develop percepts. And the example below, if you perceive the black shapes as form, then you're looking at a really interesting set of puzzle pieces. But if you perceive the white shapes as form, you can actually globally perceive the word lift. So then what I'm really saying is that in this constant perceptual cycle of taking in an environmental stimulus and processing it through early phototransduction and going on to perception and recognition, we do have a role of knowledge and experience which can affect both early and late processing to yield recognition. So the perceptual cycle then is in fact like two cycles happening at the same time. One which is stimulus driven and the other that is experience or knowledge driven. And then on top of that, attention can change what's processed very early as well as what is developed or inferred from the early processing. At every stage, attention has a role and contribution to the developing percept. So both bottom-up and top-down effects are influencing form perception or how we perceive an object. And in this really cool, interesting example, you see a lot of different forms, flowers, leaves, and bugs. And depending on the context in which you are thinking or your experiences, you might see something else as well, somewhere down there. And this makes intuitive sense. But let's go and look at how the brain might actually be doing this, how individual neurons and networks might be doing this. So what do we know about how the brain deals with this idea of perceptual grouping? We know we can do it. What's going on in the brain? Well, evidence from single unit recordings from the primary visual cortex in the monkey have shown that response to an area that is a figure is often different from response to an area that is not perceived as a figure, that is instead perceived as background. This is really important because it tells us that neural activity is modulated or affected in the very early visual areas. So on the right here, what I'm showing you is an image that was shown to the monkey. These monkeys were trained to hold their eyes fixated at this central spot. And while they were holding this fixation, the experimenters were recording from neurons that had a receptive field in particular areas of this scene. So in this demonstration, we are showing you a recording from a neuron whose preferred stimulus is this green-oriented bar. Recall that primary visual cortex neurons like small bars of different orientations. So this neuron responds to this bar in its receptive field. And you can see that when this bar is in a background of similarly oriented bars, and the monkey is actually perceiving a figure through the Gestalt grouping of similarity of orientation. So just like you, a monkey would perceive a figure on the left side of this field, and on the right, this neuron's favorite stimulus is perceived as part of the background. And you can see the activation is pretty low down here. That's firing rate per unit time. Conversely, when this same stimulus now becomes part of a perceived figure as a perceptually grouped figure in a background of differently oriented bars, the activation is much, much higher. So this particular neuron is now firing many-fold more than when it was perceiving this same stimulus and the same receptive field as the background. Why is this important? This is really important because it shows us that very early on in visual processing, the feature detectors are showing modulation of activity based on perceptual grouping. So it demonstrates that this contextual modulation of what it is that is being perceived is being fed back to the early feature detectors. So what does this tell us? It tells us something we already knew, that the brain is using what's out there, the stimulus, in a feed-forward manner to build the percept. But having built that percept, we are also simultaneously seeing feedback, regulation, or modulation. So the system is enhancing processing of whatever it is developing as a percept or recognizing as an object or grouping as an identifiable form. Another possibility for understanding how object recognition takes place in the brain is through the studies on word recognition. Now, people are really good at recognizing words in their language, and if we were to build models or networks that could then mimic the way people read words, we would get a fairly good understanding of how the brain goes about doing it. So these feature nets have been designed to try and understand this complex network of perceptual recognition. And it starts with a layer of simple feature detectors and then adds to it progressively complex integrative layers that are able to recognize more and more of the written words, so letters and then perhaps even bigrams and then the word itself or the sentence. So let's take a look at these neural network models, which can then explain how the brain might be engaged in object recognition. So the idea then is that a feature detector is activated every time it gets an input of its own favorite stimulus. So a line of a particular orientation or an arc of a particular type. And this feature detector will fire above threshold when this particular stimulus is in its receptive field and when its input is enough to give it the response threshold. This response is then transmitted to the next layer, and the next layer then collects these inputs, integrates them, and fires above threshold whenever it gets its full recognizable form. So the letter detectors need to see the whole letter, and then the word detectors need to get the whole word for them to be activated. And in this complex assembly of neurons or nodes of activation, we can then see that having some featural activation might lead to activation of the detectors, even when, for example, there is not a complete activation of every single detector in that layer. So this kind of explains how sometimes you can see closure. So when sufficient features in the feature layer add up to activate the letter detector, we might be able to complete gaps in the O, for example. Or you could also imagine how having a gap on the right side of the inputs might lead to a misrecognition of an O as a C. So these feature nets very nicely describe ways in which we might in fact be recognizing words in a language, and they behave much like people. So words that are much more frequent in a language are better recognized, and words that have been recently seen are also better recognized. This is a phenomenon called repetition priming. So if you fire up the detectors, they are likely to be more likely to fire very quickly again, and the brain neurons behave precisely so. So there's both a frequency effect and a recency effect in word recognition. These feature nets also explain how the system might be recovering from confusions or dealing with ambiguous inputs. For example, if the input stimulus is the word corn, you see activation of all of the individual feature detectors that add up to form different parts of the letters C, O, U, and other similar letters like Q, depending on the particular feature detectors that are activated. But this confusion is then clarified or reduced in the next layer, which might in fact have a higher baseline activity for the more frequent combination of letters. So CO might have a much higher or stronger baseline activity or more likely to fire than CU, CQ, and CS in this particular example. So in reading the word, then we are much more likely to end up with correct recognition of corn rather a word like CQRN. Conversely, if the actual stimulus was CQRN, then this very same system might force us to over-regularize and read CQRN as CORN. And recall that when we were looking at the example of TPUM, many of us did read it as TRUM or DRUM, which are the more frequent and more phonetically appropriate combinations of those letters. So every time there is incomplete activation or not enough time to attend and enhance activation, we can see regularization, or in some cases, like in this example, over-regularization, where actual stimulus of CQRN may be read as CORN, which is what we are more familiar with. Okay, so let's try a quick experiment and see if this is actually how we read. I'm going to show you some letters, and your task is to read whatever words you can find as quickly as possible. What did you see? Now, if you're like most people, the chances are that you read the words, the cat. But here's actually what the stimulus that I showed you. The stimulus that I showed you had the letters T, a skewed H, an E, a C, and the same skewed H again, and a T. Now, you could think of this as a skewed H, or you could think of these as incomplete A's. And clearly, when people are trying to read, they tend to think of this particular form as a skewed H and this one as an A. And if you think about how we were talking about the frequency effect in bigram layers, the TH is a much more frequent combination, whereas the CA and the AT are much more frequent combinations than CH and HT. So chances are you read it as the cat instead of the cht, which is actually what it might be. Also, no one reads it as tay cat. And once again then, ambiguous stimuli and illusions help us understand how the system is organizing percepts. McClelland and Rumelhart proposed a more recent model of word recognition, which includes many of these features that we've been talking about, but also adds in inhibitory connections between the detectors. So, for example, the HT would in fact be inhibited by the possibility of an AT. And they also included top-down connections from words to letters. So if we are reading a word which looks like a word, then all other nonsense words that could possibly be engineered from the same combination of features would in fact be inhibited. This is a much more complex feature net, having both feed-forward and feedback loops with hierarchical detectors, but at the same time, it's much more like the brain and behaves very much like people do. So these feature nets have led to a fantastic understanding of how the brain solves the problems of reading and object recognition. This then explains really nicely the role of inferences and prior experience and knowledge in perception. So Helmholtz's theory of unconscious inference, which said that perceptions are a result of unconscious assumptions about the environment based on our experiences, and the fact that we tend to perceive objects based on what is most likely to have caused a particular pattern of excitation does work. And it works for reading, but it also works for objects like these. And when you see two rectangles juxtaposed in this manner, almost everybody thinks of it or perceives it as two rectangles where one is occluding the other. And almost no one reports seeing a blue rectangle and a red L in this context. So objects are perceived based on our experiences, what we think is the most likely explanation for that pattern of activation in the brain. Palmer did some experiments about this and took it a step further and showed that observers, when they are shown a context scene, tend to recognize targets which are congruent with that scene much more easily than targets that are incongruent with that scene. So in this experiment, a scene was shown. Subjects were asked to say if the subsequently shown objects were present in the scenes they had seen. And you can see here in this case, for example, a person is much more likely to say yes, that the bread was in the kitchen scene, and then a very similar, another object, in this case the mailbox, was in that scene. Now realize that none of these objects were actually in the scene. The data shows that targets which are congruent with the context are much more likely to be reported as having been seen in that scene than targets that are incongruent. This then brings us back to this idea that the brain is in fact constantly in a perceptual cycle where it is taking all of the activations driven by the stimulus in a bottom-up or data-driven manner from the receptors, integrating it into percepts, and at the same time generating inferences about what it is that is out there and modulating these percepts in a top-down, knowledge and expectation-driven manner.